Parents, the following program is intended for people over the age of 13. If your kids are younger than that, please use the YouTube Kids app.
Welcome to Scary Stories, the channel that tells you scary stories.
Peter Bernard's Scary Stories for Adults.
Welcome to Scary Stories NYC. I'm your old pal Bigfoot. Today we've brought back Henrey Lee Dogman, and we've challenged each other once again to try to tell the scariest story possible. Last time I won, by the way. Yeah, I was getting around to that. Obviously you cheated somehow. How could I cheat? It's your show, not mine. I don't know, but I'll figure it out. Maybe it's because I told the first story. That way you told the last story, the one that stuck in their heads as they were commenting. Wow, you really put a lot of thought into this, haven't you? Yeah, I was thinking, what if the winner of the previous challenge has to read the first story of the following challenge? You want me to go first? That's fine, whatever you prefer. Fine. The one I'm saving for the very end is so good, I think we should name this episode after it. That one is called 6 Generations of Werewolves. Wow, sounds interesting. Can't wait to hear it. Well, folks, I hope you've buckled your safety belt, because I'm about to get us started with a story that truly gives me the creeps. Turn down your light. Pull up the covers, because here comes the story we call Dogman Haunted My Family. Dear Scary Stories NYC, when I was a kid, I had truly nightmarish encounters with Dogman, but we didn't have the word Dogman back then, at least not in my town or in my family. We called it a lot of things, such as a hairy demon, but it was just like what people talk about in some of the Dogman stories that you read these days. It shook up my entire family and really caused us to live in fear for a while there. Let me go back to the beginning and explain it as it happened, in the order it happened in. One night, I was in bed around 10 or 11, but I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking I was hearing someone outside the window, and one time, I saw a shadow too. Too chicken to get out of bed and look, I just lay there in bed, with the covers pulled up over my head, and tried to find explanations for what I was hearing. Explanations that would make me feel safe instead of scared. Then, I heard it, outside the window. Someone was standing there now. I could hear them breathing and shuffling in the muddy dirt. I pulled my head out from under the covers, and I could see a vague shadow behind the window. Or was I imagining that? Someone spoke my name outside, and I dove back down under my covers. It sounded like my grandmother. My paternal grandmother. She was the one who had passed on last month. I loved Grandma and I missed her, but this wasn't the way I wanted to be reunited. I heard my name again, in her voice, and it sounded so pleasant. Back came all my memories of my grandmother, and I had to at least go look-see. I got out of bed and stood up, regaining my balance both literally and emotionally, before taking the first step toward that window. Was this going to be my grandma's ghost outside? I wondered. I took a second step toward it. Would she appear as an angel? If she were an angel, she could have just appeared here inside my room. I took a third step toward the window. Why would she be outside? Unless she rose from her grave and walked all the way here from the cemetery? Unsure if I was doing the right thing, I took a tentative fourth step toward that window. I was close enough now to reach out and grab that curtain in my hand. Even so, it took me some time to build up the courage. I wanted to do this, but I also really wanted to go run back into bed. A laughing voice came from outside, saying my name again. She laughed like I was being silly, so I figured I probably was. Grabbing the curtain and pulling it back from the window, I looked out and saw 2 glowing, orange-red eyes, shaped as though they were furious at me. All I saw at first was those eyes. Then I witnessed a mouth opening beneath those eyes. This was not a normal mouth. It was feral, canine. The bright white teeth it revealed seemed too long to fit in that nasty-looking snout. This was some kind of dog, but it was taller than I was, and I was already 5'8" or 9 probably by that point. I was going to turn 15 in 2 months, I think, when this all went down. I would guess that whoever or whatever I was looking at was over 6 feet tall, but whoever it was wasn't impossibly tall. It might have been a guy in a costume, but I really don't think so. It seemed alive, but not in the normal sense. Its hair blew all around as though there were a windstorm going outside. And there was no windstorm going on outside. Maybe you'll understand what I mean if you visualize it walking through a field of electricity. Like all its hair was standing on end, all over, and blowing around. It just didn't look like a guy in a suit or an unidentified animal. It looked like it had walked up from hell. I screamed and ran upstairs to my parents' room. I felt embarrassed doing that at my age, but I was completely freaked out about what had just happened. I couldn't connect the voice of my grandmother with what I saw out there, and the confusion made me even more frightened than witnessing what I had seen. My father woke up and believed my story, pulling on his bathrobe and running downstairs and out the front door. He looked around, but didn't see anyone there. He came back in pretty angry and told me that it must be one or more of the kids in the neighborhood trying to be funny. He was deeply offended that they chose to impersonate his late mother, and so he took this all very personally. My father quizzed me about the height of the so-called demon monster. Then we went down a list of who was around that height, who would remember what my grandma sounded like. It was a short list, and there were 3 kids, a little older than I was, who my father was certain were behind this. He thought it might be one of them, or it might be all 3 of them, but he couldn't figure out who else it could be. I asked him not to accuse them unless he found proof, because I didn't want to do anything to start a fight with those 3. The real reason I didn't want my father accusing anyone was that I was pretty certain that what I saw was not human. I didn't know what it was that I saw, but it couldn't have been a man in a suit as far as I was concerned. So let's skip ahead to the next night. I went to bed around 10 or 10:30, but once again, I couldn't sleep because I was hearing someone outside that window again. I thought about going to get my father, but I really just wanted it to go away, and I wanted to sleep. Then I heard my name being spoken outside the window, and it felt like a bolt of lightning had shot through me. It wasn't my grandmother's voice this time, though. It was my father's voice, and he sounded angry. I was frozen, staring at the window from my bed. I didn't know whether to go run upstairs and see if my father was up there, or pull the covers over my head and pray for it to leave me alone. A hard rapping at my window bolted me upright. Was it gonna break in? My father's voice stated my name again, louder this time, and angrier. He was ordering me to go to the window. Realizing it was inevitable, I got up and marched toward that window to pull the curtain back. I braced myself for what I might see, and in my mind, I rehearsed the path that I would run upstairs to get my real father. I took one final deep breath, then grabbed the curtain and pulled it back. What I saw on the other side of that glass was not what I was expecting to see at all. It was actually my dad, and he looked really, really mad. I asked him what was up, and he asked me if I had made large dog tracks. I didn't understand what he was talking about, and that annoyed him further. Apparently, there were dog tracks in the mud outside my window, and they were too large to be real. Did I think I was being funny? He could tell by my utter confusion that I really didn't know what he was talking about, and I didn't make fake dog prints outside my window to bother him. You could tell my father was confused. He didn't have a simple explanation for what was going on anymore. If neighborhood kids wanted to scare me, would they really go the full route to get or make shoes that left giant dog prints behind? That would imply they had access to brains and a budget, and the three main suspects in my father's mind had neither. I asked Dad if he could please knock on my door and not my window, as it scared the hell out of me when he did that, and he actually apologized. I think that was the first time my dad ever apologized to me, and maybe the last time too. He didn't do that too often. Okay, my details might be a little messy on the next part, but it was either 1 or 2 nights later, or later that same week at least, that I next had a nighttime visitation outside my window. This time, as I was about to fall asleep, I heard the voice speaking to me. I hadn't heard anyone milling about first this time, so it was different from the other times. This time, the voice was a girl I knew from school, and she sounded like she was crying. She said my name in a very sad way, and then she said it again. I really have to say, I didn't know what to expect this time, but by that point, I was sort of resigned to all this. It was just something I had to get up and do. It was not in any way less frightening than the previous times. In fact, it was a lot more frightening. I felt as though my skin were electrified. I had goosebumps, and I felt as though I were walking through that same field of electricity that caused all my hair to levitate off my body in all directions, like the dogman I had seen that first night. Once again, I braced myself, and once again, I grabbed that curtain. Once again, I pulled the cloth back, and once again I peered outside. Only this time, I saw that my window and my window screen were wide open. I didn't remember opening either of them, and this time, before I even consciously noticed the eyes glowing in the darkness, a large clawed hand reached in, aiming its human-like fingers with taloned ends directly toward my throat. I swear I somersaulted backward, but it wasn't as graceful in real life as that sounds in the description. It just happened out of pure instinct. I reared backward away from that claw so fast that I lost balance and fell backward, and my momentum carried me the rest of the wobbly way. I wouldn't have won any medals with it, but at least I managed not to hurt myself, and I made it out of my bedroom door with that monster still outside. This time, my father grabbed his Louisville Slugger before heading downstairs. We didn't know if the Dogman was going to be inside the house or out, and he searched all of downstairs before looking around outside. He said the exterior of my window had been clawed up, and the thing had somehow opened my window from the outside. My father went and got his tools and started hammering the window shut until our neighbor shouted at him to quit it. I didn't want to sleep downstairs that night, and I asked if I could use the guest bedroom upstairs. Well, I pretty much moved into that guest bedroom, and I helped Dad seal up all the downstairs windows all the way around the next morning. He had central heating and air conditioning installed, and it became like living in a department store downstairs. We considered moving, but then the Dogman seemed to move on instead. None of us ever had anything like that happen to any of us again after that. So, I guess you might say that we never found out for sure what exactly happened the time that Dogman haunted my family. Okay, Henry, that was pretty scary, I gotta admit. Do you think you can top it? Well, I think I can try. One of the scariest things about Dogman is his remarkable physical ability. He can move so fast, he's even known to chase moving cars. Here's a particularly terrifying account from the son of a retired police officer who claims his dad chased the spring-heeled Dogman. Dear Scary Stories NYC, my father was a police officer in Wisconsin for 17 years, but after he retired, he almost never talked about his police days. About a year before he passed, he told me a story one night that really knocked my socks off. I had been talking about Spring-Heeled Jack, and he got very interested. He was unaware of the stories of how, in England, there were reports of a strange man, back in the 1800s, who would frighten ladies by either lighting something up on his chest or firing flames from his chest, depending on your interpretation. I told Dad that he got the nickname Spring-Heeled Jack because he was seen leaping tall fences and leaping to rooftops to make his getaway. It doesn't seem he was ever accused of doing anything worse than mischief. It wasn't like he hurt anybody as far as what I had read. There are paranormal and UFO researchers who speculate about the idea that possibly Spring-Heeled Jack might have been an alien or an ultra-terrestrial. Maybe he came from the flying saucers or from the future. At the time, people thought he must be a very rich man to be able to have the high-tech devices he seemed to carry and to be able to afford high-tech springs in the heels of his shoes that would carry him to safety. If he were a good guy, why did he have to disguise himself to look so frightening? Why, to frighten the real bad guys, came the answer. Soon, fictional stories about Spring-Heeled Jack, the rich man hero who disguised himself to look frightening and had high-tech devices, which made him appear paranormal, were selling like hotcakes in the penny dreadful magazines of the era. Soon, Spring-Heeled Jack appeared as the hero of plays. All of this was just entering the public domain as Bruce Wayne and Batman were created from the ashes of Spring-Heeled Jack's legacy. My father wasn't impressed with those theories, though. He told me there was no way that was a normal man. He spoke with conviction, as though he had been there. I asked him if he time-traveled to Old England, and if not, how could he be so sure? Dad withdrew at first, as if reconsidering continuing the conversation, but eventually, he relented and told me he was going to tell me a story, but I had to promise never to repeat it to my mother. That made me laugh, and I agreed. According to my father, he and his partner got called to a disturbance at a late-night store. When they got there, they saw a man with a blinking light on his chest running out of the place. Dad said it looked like that light on Iron Man's chest in the comic books. Dad and his partner got out of their cop car and squatted down behind the doors on either side, unaware if the guy was armed. They got him in their sights and ordered him to lie down on the sidewalk. They gave him one more warning and said that if he didn't comply, they were going to have to fire. I asked him what the guy looked like, and Dad said he seemed to have a dog-shaped head. I laughed, but my father shot me a hard glance, and I realized he was being for real. I asked him to elaborate on what that meant that a man with a light on his chest had a dog's head. My father said his attention was mainly on trying to suss out if that thing on the guy's chest was a weapon or if he was armed in any other sense. Other than that, with the bright light shining in their faces, he and his partner mainly could make out that its silhouette seemed to have the outline of a dog-headed man, or a very large dog standing upright on its hind legs. Well, according to Dad, that dog guy bent his dog knees just a little, and he thought he was about to get down on the sidewalk as he had been asked to do. But instead, that dog man flew straight up in the air and backward, landing somehow on the roof of the store behind him and running away. I wasn't clear if he flipped in the air or just went up and backward, but I got the impression that the guy landed on his feet up on the roof behind him. However he landed, he hit that roof running away toward the back of the building. Dad and his partner got back in the police car and drove around the side toward the back, where they saw that guy leap off the roof of the back of the store and just keep running. Dad said his partner said ouch when the guy touched ground, expecting him to crumple. But nothing of the sort happened. He landed on his hind legs and kept running that way, bipedally, moving at least as fast as their patrol vehicle was going. The figure came up on a tall, chain-link fence that Dad said had to have been at least 20 feet high, and Dad said he, quote, rose over it, then landed and kept on running. I asked what that meant, rose over it. Did he mean the guy jumped over the fence? Dad said that when you jump over something, it has a certain look to it. You can tell that the propulsion is coming from your legs, or your pole that you're vaulting with, or whatever. It looks like it makes sense, according to the laws of physics. When this guy went over that fence, Dad said it looked as though he were being lifted and swung over by a rope attached to his back. He said the guy's thick dog legs even swung back and forth in the air as he flew over the obstacle, the way they might if he was being pulled up from behind by a string. Before I could even ask if there might have been a helicopter overhead and if he might have been seeing a movie shoot, Dad assured me that he neither saw nor heard any helicopter flying overhead. It had to be some technology at work, he told me. He was certain about this. But whatever kind of tech that was had to be more advanced than anything we're officially allowed to know about. This, my father told me, threw him into a quandary. If the guy they saw was an actual alien or an enemy agent, then he would be derelict in his duty if he did not report the incident and put it on the official record. If, on the other hand, the tech belonged to our side or high-powered interests in the USA, then reporting it might be considered treason. And in either case, he'd be placing not only his own life in danger, but the lives of his entire family as well. So, he and his partner decided to report as little as they could. They reported the testimony of the store owner, then claimed that when they pursued, they saw nothing, and the man had somehow gotten away. They downplayed it and moved on as quickly as they could, not wanting to make any waves. Both my parents are gone now, so hopefully Dad is okay with me telling his old story to you. I'm keeping it anonymous anyway, just in case it might actually get me in some sort of trouble, even this many years later. I never saw my father look so spooked as he did when he told me this story, and it was not fun to see those expressions on his face. He had always seemed undefeated to me, but on that day, I saw genuine fear in his eyes, because that was the day when he confessed to me about the spring-heeled Dogman.
You know what time is coming soon, don't you? The day of the wearing of the green skin. I'm inviting you to me St. Patrick's Day Dogman Party. The one and only Dr. Death St. Patrick's Day Scary Story Special. An extra long episode, and only us ghouls and ghosts and deceased individuals are invited. Oh, all right. You seem cool. You can come too. It all happens here on the Scary Stories NYC channel, Tuesday, March 17th. Feel free to arrive early. All my other guests are late.
That was a weird story, all right. I saw in a recent poll on YouTube that viewers of this channel were requesting a story about the black-eyed kids. I have a story here that not only features BEKs, but Dogman too. It's all kinds of unsettling, and I call it The Black-Eyed Kids and Dogman. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I've had a pretty normal, boring life, and I'm proud of that. I have a wife and a kid and a job at a company, and everything is incredibly normal by plan and design. It takes a lot of work to have a boring life, believe me. But I had one day that was so incredibly scary and weird and out of the ordinary that it deserves to be in some kind of Guinness Book of the Weirdest Days of All Time or something. If I were you, I'd be sitting, or better yet, lying down, when you hear this story, and don't listen to it while operating heavy machinery. I get scared each time I retell it, so I just want to write it down for you, then try to forget it ever happened. If I ever felt something like this was going to happen to me again, I don't know what I'd do. Probably just lose my mind. My greatest fear is encountering any of the three figures in this story ever again. Okay, this happened around 2009-ish. I didn't have GPS in my car. I had paper maps in the glove compartment, all folded back the wrong way. I was trying to drive home using a shortcut I had never used before, and I got lost along a dark old country highway. It was cut out of the woods and had a grass partition in the middle with 2 lanes of traffic going in opposite directions on either side. There was nothing but the highway and the forest as far as you could see in any direction. I pulled off onto the grass on the right and pulled out one of the maps, studying it intently and trying to imagine where I made the wrong turn. Suddenly, there was a tapping on the driver's seat window to my left, and I leaped in the air and out of my skin. I think I made a sound like a comedy character would make in an old movie when that tapping happened. I instantly was completely gripped by fear. I was in the middle of nowhere, lost, and there was no other traffic anywhere. Plus, at night, any intrusion from outside naturally takes on an ominous feel. I looked to my left, and I saw 2 kids in dark hoodies, with the hoodies pulled all the way up, so I could really only see their noses and mouths. I looked around quickly to see if a car had pulled up behind me while I was preoccupied, but There was still nothing to be seen in any direction but the highway and the trees, and of course the stars above us. These kids couldn't possibly be there. I didn't say anything. I didn't roll down my window. I just looked at them. The taller kid, expressionless, tapped on my window again. I didn't like any part of this, and I had half a mind to peel out of there, but I knew I would have felt dumb afterward if I got scared of two kids. I rolled down my window just enough that I could hear them speak and ask them what they wanted. "You need to give us a lift home, mister," said the taller one. "You need to ask us into your motor vehicle, then we can get in with you." I asked them to give me their parents' phone number and offered to call them on my cell phone so that they could come pick up the two boys. The boys stood there, blankly, unresponsive. I started to repeat the offer and the older one interrupted me, telling me that their mother was waiting for them and I needed to let them in so I could drive them home to their mother. I stared back at the two boys, not really knowing what to say. The younger one said, "We can't get in until you say it's okay, mister," and I looked at him more closely than I had before. There was something really strange about that kid. The older one waved his hand in front of the smaller one's face, as though to distract me from looking too closely. Then he repeated his opening monologue in a far more threatening-sounding manner than he had during his first run-through. It was as though they had limited scripts available to them, as they kept repeating variations on the same theme over and over again, but in a nastier way each time. Eventually, the taller kid grew impatient and leaned forward, trying to look in my back seat for some reason. As he did so, his face was lit by the interior car light, and for the first time, I saw very clearly that this kid did not have any whites in his eyes. People ask me if I mean he looked like an alien, and I have to admit I don't know what an alien looks like. What I would compare it to is the eye of a deer in the headlights, just black and dilated as wide as possible. If there were whites in those eyes, they barely existed around the edges. I shouted in horror, just as though they were the adults and I was the kid. I didn't like the way it felt like they were in control of the situation, so I just took the cart out of neutral and I floored it out of there. I looked in my rear view mirror but didn't see them. I guess they ran back in the woods where they had been hiding. But if they were scammers of some sort, how had they known to hide right near where I would stop? If they had been real kids in trouble, they would have given me a phone number to call, so I know they had to have been up to no good of some sort or another. I know they could not have been telling the truth. So, what exactly had happened? And where exactly was I heading? I hadn't had time to study the map long enough to solve that situation, and I no longer had the nerve to pull over along this particularly weird stretch of highway. I decided I would just have to drive until I found something open where I could ask directions, or at least stay in a well-lit area while I read my map. I was lost in Vineland or near it, which is a part of New Jersey that's extra creepy at night. Better to drive it during the day first and learn it, which is the opposite of what I was doing. It felt like I was driving for a half hour and hadn't seen any buildings. I might be exaggerating because this happened years ago, but it sure felt like I was trapped in an unending nightmare. So, of course, right as I thought that I was trapped in a nightmare, this very tall, hairy man ran out from behind a tree like he had been waiting for me all night. It was like the director yelled action, and this guy ran out for my car. I screamed and swerved the car, and I barely avoided hitting the guy, but at one point, my headlights were shining directly on him, and he was the freak show of the year. He either was hairy all over, or he was wearing animal skins because I saw no clothing. He either had a dog or wolf-like head, or he was wearing a wolf head as a mask or helmet or something. It all happened so fast, I can't be perfectly sure. In my gut, I'll be honest, I think what I saw was a dogman. That having been said, I was in a high-stress state and was still terrified by what had happened with those two kids back there. So, I was on edge before the man or creature entered the picture. That might have a lot to do with what I saw or what I thought I was seeing. Maybe it was a daredevil weirdo in a costume. Maybe it wasn't an actual dogman, whatever a dogman actually is. However, if that was a guy in a suit, he was a complete nut job. He might have given himself a bad boo-boo the way he ran out in front of my car. And then, after I managed to save his life by swerving around him, he thanked me by grabbing my back fender and trying to stop my car from getting away. He actually tried to physically stop a moving vehicle with his hands. I mean, he must have had hands, because it felt like he grabbed the back fender. I had to pound the gas pedal to get away from him, but he pulled out a corner of the bumper in the process. I drove away and saw the man drop to all fours and run after me as though he were some kind of wild dog. I wonder if I witnessed a shaman that night, or if it was just some meth head tweaking, or obviously, maybe it really was a dogman, or werewolf, or something of that nature. The thing is, you can't tell me that the first incident had nothing to do with the second one. Those black-eyed kids had something to do with that dogman. Maybe both events were hallucinations. Maybe there was a gas leak in the area. On the other hand, if that's the case, then what exactly happened to my back fender? There had to be some real element to what happened. Maybe I was imagining or confused about what I was seeing. But something had to have actually been there outside of me and outside of my nervous system that pulled out my bumper like that. And I think something was physically there next to my car when I saw those two kids as well. I think there was something living and conscious with very bad intentions for me standing right there, telling me I should invite it into my car and my life. Maybe that consciousness was the exact same thing that I saw the second time as the dogman? All I know is, after that, my life went back to being really boring and very normal. I knock on wood as I say that, hoping it keeps on keeping on in the boring fashion. I really honestly truly never again want to experience anything in any way like what I went through in New Jersey on the night that I encountered the black-eyed kids and Dogman. Hey Alicia, did you see that Jim Steranko is appearing at the Northeast Comic-Con?
I did not know that.
Yeah, plus the amazing Kreskin.
Oh my god, that's so like Festin or Raidering, yo.
Plus, from the 1970s, it's John Davidson.
Gasp.
The guy from Buffy.
Badass.
The cop from Mr. Rogers.
Badasser.
The blue chick from the TV show.
Badasserest.
And of course, it's all hosted by Gary Summers, the king of pop culture.
We hear it for Gary Summoners and stuff.
All this and more, March 13th through 15th.
OMG.
At the Boxborough Regency in Massachusetts.
Yay!
Right next door to my home, Wolf Swamp. Here's a scary dogman of a different type. Here's the story about the time devil dog appeared in our yard. Dear Scary Stories NYC. This story happened around 4 or 5 years ago when I was home visiting my family for the holidays. It had to have happened in 2014 or 2015 for reasons I'll explain later on. It has to do with a sighting of a kind of a dogman famous in England and known as Black Shuck. Now, my family is not British. In fact, we are still to this day based in Indiana, but we all knew the story of Black Shuck because my mother used to read us monster stories before we went to bed at night. I remember she would read from old, yellowed paperback books from the 20th century. I forget the titles and authors, but I'm guessing maybe Frank Edwards and John Keel. Some of them were written for children, and those were never as good as the ones written for general audiences. Although the drawback of Mom reading the books written for adults was, every time she came upon a word we didn't know, she would put the bookmark in the book, then put the book down, then she would stand up, walk across the bedroom to the bookshelf, bend over and find the dictionary, pull it out, walk back to her seat, look up the word, and read the definition to us. She would make us use the word in 2 sentences correctly before she would smile, stand up, walk the book back to the bookcase, then return and find her place in the monster story. One day, I moved the dictionary over to my bed table before she started reading. She told me she was proud of me for using the dictionary on my own, but actually, I just wanted to cut down the time it took for her to look up words during the bedtime monster stories. One of my brother and my favorite stories that we ever heard was the story of Black Shuck. We both thought that Black Shuck was in actuality a dogman. If you don't know the story, it has been reported in British history as fact that on the date of August 4th in the year 1577, church was being held during a thunderstorm. A clap of lightning and thunder heralded the doors bursting open, and the largest black dog anyone had ever seen burst in. Its eyes were said to glow red as it made short work of ending the lives and dreams of churchgoers. Although Shuck was said to move with lightning quickness and could claim victims easily, he didn't even need to touch a person to spell their doom. Just to look upon the monster was said to be enough to claim your life itself. After attacking Holy Trinity Church in Blythburgh, it left and attacked parishioners at St. Mary's Church in Bungay, which is over 10 miles away. Both my brother and I were and are fascinated by Dogman, so this story stuck out in our minds as a possible medieval sighting of him. Maybe he moved too quickly in both events for people to notice him standing on his hind legs, or maybe his horrific actions seemed more important for the people of the time to report than his bipedal motion. On the other hand, maybe he just never exhibited this behavior in front of the surviving witnesses. After all, there are a number of dogman sightings in which the creature remains on all fours like a normal dog, but is too large and too intelligent or evil-seeming to just be a regular pooch. So, the way I know this story took place in 2014 or 2015 is because it was back around then that someone found remains of a dog that would have been 7 feet long in life, buried in a shallow grave in a churchyard just a few miles from where the story of the legendary Black Shuck took place. My brother brought this up, and neither I nor my parents had heard of this before. We checked the internet and were amazed to find that it was true. The article we read made the odd comment that the dog would have been 7 foot tall if it stood on its hind legs. I'm not sure why they even said that, unless maybe they were thinking the same thing that my brother and I had thought since we were kids, that possibly this Black Shuck was actually some kind of a dogman or werewolf when it was alive. This truly was a remarkable and surreal experience. After all those years, to be back in the home I had first heard the Black Shuck legend in, looking at images of what might have been the remains of the actual beast itself. A memorable experience for me and my family, but not enough to write a story for you about. So, why am I writing you then? Well, the next night, as we were all getting ready to hit the hay, my brother screamed from his bedroom, and the three of us all ran in to see what had happened. He was fine, but he was staring out of the back window at the yard outside in the darkness. When we got a good look at what he was seeing, we all felt like we had gone insane. My mother gasped. My father shouted, "No way!" And I probably said stuff I can't repeat as we all looked out that window. And I'll be darned if we didn't see the largest dog any of us had ever seen. It had to be 4 or 5 feet tall at the shoulder, and I swear it had bright red eye shine coming from those eyes. It was not looking up at us. It was staring toward our driveway. Maybe it had pursued some other animal here, and that's where it thought the animal had gone. It just stood at attention, motionless. It was not panting. Its tail remained perfectly still and pointed downward. After a period of just staring in dumb, shocked astonishment, my father came to his senses first and started barking out orders. He told us to keep the lights out in the bedroom to prevent glare and reflection on the windows, and we should get our cell phone cameras ready. Then he ran downstairs to turn the backyard lights on so we could all get a nice, well-lit, and in-focus photo of something that couldn't possibly exist. Well, we got our cameras, and we got it as dark as we could in that room. Dad did his part, turning on the backyard nighttime floodlights from the switch in the basement. But as soon as those lights flashed on, I couldn't see where the dogman went. I admit, I was blinded momentarily as the lights flashed on, but it wasn't as though those lights were in our faces. They were below and pointed forward toward the yard and the now missing Black Shuck dog. The three of us made sounds like you would hear at a Penn and Teller show, like ooh and ah. We had no idea how that trick had been done, or even who had performed it for us, but that was one heck of a trick, all right. This event really opened my mind to the strange nature of our universe, and that the only thing we can really be sure of in life is that we can't be sure of anything. It can be terrifying to think about, but I choose to be amazed and to wonder about everything. I even wonder about big, scary, predatory, mythical creatures that can end you just by looking at you. And that's because a devil dog appeared in my yard.
I strongly suggest you get comfortable, dim the lights, and get your popcorn ready. This is the one we call
the Bat-Winged Dogman. Dear Scary Stories NYC, this is a story about seeing a dogman in Hellertown, Pennsylvania, or just outside of it, right after I ate at a Waffle House restaurant. In no way do I want this story to reflect poorly on either Hellertown, which is a hell of a town, or Waffle House, which is God's gift to hungry insomniacs. I've driven through the one and bought breakfast at the other more times since then than I care to admit to, so please don't think the monster in this story scared me off of either. But, that having been said, this monster was the scariest and most inexplicable thing I have ever seen. I tell you one thing I've changed since then. I get my tires replaced far more regularly. Oh, and another thing. I drive with all my windows shut at night these days. I'm about to explain why. My story starts after a date I had. No, I did not bring my date to the Waffle House. I brought her home. Then, she wouldn't let me kiss her goodnight. And then I went to the Waffle House, near the Holiday Inn, alone, to drown my sorrows in their coffee and carbs. I don't know how long I stayed there, but I know I had 2 breakfasts, so it was almost going to be daylight soon when I finally left. Not yet, though, as it was still very dark outside. I started driving in the direction where I live, and I got a flat tire in that area just past the Lost River Caverns, where Durham Street turns into Wassergrass Road. Now, this is not a rural area, and I was parked directly across the street from a house set back in the woods a little ways as I fixed my flat tire. I was not feeling nervous there at all. In fact, I was trying to be quiet so as not to wake the neighbors as I made the repairs. Fortunately for me, it was as I was finished and putting my tools back in the trunk when I saw it. This was a huge, prehistoric-looking, dog-headed ape man, and it was coming out of the trees on that family's property across the street from me. I want to be clear, it was not emerging from the woods, but from someone's front yard. That having been said, beyond that house, there is forest for literally miles and miles. My immediate thought was that this was something from deep in that forest, but I also weirdly felt that it might be something that lived underground and had come up out of the cavern system, which a lot of us feel is largely unexplored by humans. I know it sounds silly that I immediately thought of it as an underground animal, but its eyes were lit up like a coal miner's helmet, and my gut instinct told me that this was something used to being in zero-light situations. How many creatures above ground face zero-light situations all that often? Not many. So, people always ask me for a detailed description of the Dogman and ask me if I took a photo, but it wasn't like we were hanging out having brunch, and it wasn't like this was a photo op. This was a weird guy standing nearly 8 feet tall, and he didn't appear too friendly. When I said it was like an ape man before, I meant it was hairy all over like a monkey. It stood tall and proud like a human, though not bent over like a primate. In fact, it stood so straight and tall that it almost seemed to walk in a slightly robotic way. In terms of details, I remember it being dark. I remember it had dog ears and a long snout. I remember it was shaggy all over, and that it smelled like the zoo as soon as that thing came out of the woods. At that point, I slammed my trunk and made a run for the driver's seat door. I threw myself back into the car, turning the key in the ignition before I had gotten both legs inside or closed the door. The car started, and in my side view mirror I saw a lot of motion. It sounded like sails unfurling in the wind as the creature amazingly revealed huge, bat-like wings behind itself. I screamed incoherently. I no longer felt like this was an explainable animal. This was either something demonic or something from a nightmare. This was something wrong, and I had to leave. It's hard to close your car door while accelerating on a local road, but that's what I did. And again, in my mirror, I saw something utterly impossible happening. That dog-headed man-robot thing was running after me, flapping its wings, furiously. I've read a lot of Mothman stories, and they are said to just spread their wings and fly up in the air without the wings moving at all. This was not that. It was flapping furiously and trying to get up off the ground. Dust and leaves were flying everywhere from the extreme winds being generated by those wings, which were so wide, I wasn't sure where he found the room on that road to spread them. I could hear the wings flapping over my head as I gunned that car faster than the local speed limit and still couldn't gain on the bat dog thing up in the air above me. I came up on my home and then kept driving right on past it as I was too afraid to slow the car down. I kept speeding along, almost hoping a cop would try to arrest me and scare the flapping dog monster away. The story ends somewhat anticlimactically as a line of 3 cars driving close to each other coming from the other direction is what seemed to scare the creature off. I stopped hearing the flapping, but I kept on driving for another full hour till well past the sun was up before I got up the nerve to turn around and head back home. I have zero explanation for what I saw and what chased me, but I know it was a once-in-a-lifetime experience because that thing was clearly out of place. It didn't belong there, and I don't expect it's ever come back, or ever will. Nevertheless, that's my account of the time I got chased down the road by the bat-winged Dogman. I've got 2 scary Dogman stories for you about brothers. I'll tell you an all-new story about a dogman that stuck his nose in the window of 2 brothers to sniff their scent. That's coming up in a little while, but first, here's another all-new tale that we've decided to call Dogman Got My Brother in Trouble. Dear Scary Stories NYC, when I was in college, I came home on break one time to find my family in turmoil. My parents were furious at my high school senior brother because he insisted his terrifying story about being chased by Dogman was true. Mom and Dad accused my brother, who we can call Joe, of lying. Joe was hurt that they were so set in their beliefs that they wouldn't even consider a story told to them by their own son. Once he related the strange narrative to me, I got stuck in the middle of their disagreement, unable to please either side. I pulled Joe off to the side so he could tell me his entire story without interruption. He said it happened when he was with his girlfriend that I'll call Mary Lou. We got her on Skype or FaceTime or whatever he has on his phone, and so I got to ask her side of things. She pretty much told the same stories, adding some details Joe missed or leaving some out that he had put in. Both of them seemed then and seem now honest, and I'm not sure why they would be lying about any of it. But let me just tell you their story, and you can decide for yourself. Mary Lou had a job interview in town, and Joe had gone to meet her at the train and walk her home. Whenever she had a reason to get dressed up, Joe made a point of guarding her to prevent the other boys in town from getting too close. He talked her into taking a notorious shortcut that actually took a lot longer by cutting through the local woods. Obviously, Joe was just looking to get his pretty and nice girlfriend away from nosy people and have a little private time. Maybe you can remember back to when you were in high school, how hard it was to find a spot where there weren't people staring at you, eavesdropping, and prying into your personal business. Already as a college student, I took pity on the 2 of them. At least I had a dorm room at school I could bring close friends into. These 2 only had that shortcut through the forest. So, once Joe and Mary Lou got into the woods on that day, there was a lot of dilly-dallying. When they weren't dillying, they were busy dallying. If you dilly and dally long enough, you'll discover, as they did, that the day has ended and the darkness of night is going to begin approaching fast. Night can be romantic, sure, when it's quiet, but sometimes nights aren't quiet. Sometimes they get interrupted by the screaming howls of creatures that aren't entirely wolves. On that afternoon that stretched into an evening, my brother and his girlfriend were interrupted in their dalliance by a very loud, dog-like howl. This howl was of a most unique kind. This howl brought with it an unnatural and all-encompassing fear, a fear that grips you and overwhelms you. The force of the howl was such that both of them knew they needed to get out of that location as soon as physically possible, even though neither of them could explain why. Somehow they knew that wasn't just some stray dog howling. Joe told me that when this happened, he shot to attention within a second and was at full alert. He couldn't believe how dark it had become so fast. It was much harder to see out than he had realized, but he was 100% certain of the direction that howling had emanated from. It was directly to his left, off in the darkness. That was the direction they needed to walk to get Mary Lou home. But he knew another path to the right that eventually led to the same place. They walked right into the night, holding hands. Mary Lou noticed then how dark it had become and began a narrative discussing that and other things she was noticing, like how much danger they might be in. Joe, for his part, was trying to keep quiet and think. He politely suggested Mary Lou do the same, and she got the hint. "Sometimes I don't shut up," Mary Lou told me over my brother's phone with a smile, and the two of them shared a private laugh. They didn't have to offer me any explanations or elaborations. I got the point, and I believed them on that score. So, there's this pretty bopple-mouthed girl, and there's my idiot younger brother, and the two of them are walking through the misty darkness of the local woods, which are the darkest and most isolated part of our town. If you keep walking into those woods, it will lead you out of town and off into wilderness so huge that it's really not that hard to get lost in forever. And you certainly wouldn't be the first to do it either. No, this was a small patch of woods, but it was connected to the woods with a capital W. I mean, the mythic woods, the deep and endless American woods that some say hide predators far more varied than those currently known to human science. Even a small patch of woods in a nice town can be visited by the deepest living mysteries possible on certain nights. On this night in particular, the mystery came out of the mist, looking for my brother and Mary Lou. Both of them said that as they started walking away from their spot, they heard a sound like a dog walking on concrete behind them. Like they could hear the nails on the pavement. Do you know that sound? They tried to hurry their step, but Mary Lou could only go so fast because she hadn't brought walking shoes with her to her job interview. She says she was scared, but more for Joe. That made me laugh, and I asked her why. She said Joe promised her he wouldn't let her get hurt, and she believed him. She was just afraid that he would get himself hurt while protecting her. Who knew my dim-wit little brother had a streak of courage running through him? Or maybe he only grew it because of this girl. At any rate, they quickened their step and tried to get ahead of the dog, which sounded very large. Whatever speed they went, though, that dog seemed to know and to keep pace with them. Finally, the chase ended as Mary Lou lost her footing and slipped. Joe caught her and was helping her regain her feet when they were both shocked by the creator of that fear-filled howl as it burst angrily into the clearing that they were standing in. This was not a dog that had been chasing them. Oh, its head looked like that of a dog, that's for sure. Its body sure didn't, though. I asked both of them separately to tell me what they saw staring at them in the clearing that night. Mary Lou told me it was the werewolf of a giant man. I asked her to explain what she meant, and she said it looked like a werewolf, but it was so tall that the man it changed back into must have been a giant. I guess that makes sense. I pressed them to define giant in this context. Was it King Kong-sized? Godzilla-sized? They both laughed and said the dog was around 9 feet tall. I was impressed. 9 feet tall at the shoulder? I asked, confused. That was when they explained to me this dog was standing up on its hind legs. This dog had a broad, man-like chest covered in dog hair, and it had big, muscular arms ending in these claws that were almost like hands. The creepiest thing about this nasty-looking thing, my brother told me, was its eyes. They freaking glowed like they were LED lights or something. He didn't remember what color they were. He just said they glowed in real life the way a cat's eyes glow in a cell phone video if you leave the flash on. Mary Lou said that to her the creepiest thing about it was the length of its teeth. Like a dog can tear you apart, and this thing was like a dog, but a normal dog's teeth are not very long. This dog had a jaw full of prehistorically long teeth. It was more like a cat's fangs than a dog's. Wow, I remember saying, so you guys really did see a werewolf then? A werewolf of a giant, Mary Lou corrected me. They continued their story, which involved the werewolf chasing them out of the woods and halfway down a lonely block outside of the park. As they drew closer to a family having a party in their backyard, the wolf-headed man slowed down and thought better of following them any further. That's when I remembered, Joe told me. When he howled, nobody howled back. And? I asked because I didn't get his point. And he was alone, my brother explained. According to Mary Lou, Joe turned and started walking back toward the monster, challenging him to a fight. Joe downplayed it in his retelling, but Mary Lou insisted that he dared that monster to come get him now that he was back on the human side of town. He dared that werewolf or dogman or whatever it was to come mess with our civilization, and that dogman would not take his challenge. When he saw he was walking into a settlement of humans, Joe reasoned, he remembered that he was alone, and he turned around to leave. I kinda thought their story was plausible, although I had no idea my brother was such a badass. I wished they could produce some evidence so that my parents would lay off of them. Did you notice if the animal left any footprints or anything? I asked, racking my brain for a solution to the unrest in my family. Is that really what your concern would be? Joe asked. You're trying to protect your girlfriend from a monster. Would you then run back and take photos of the footprints? Or would you get your girlfriend home? I sat down with my parents after that to hear their side of events. It turned out that their entire problem with the story was that, in their opinion, werewolves don't exist. Period. That was their objection. Joe was telling a story that was about a werewolf, so therefore, it was a lie. They were caught up in their beliefs, allowing pre-made dogma to overrule reality, and they were getting caught up in semantics on top of that. Okay, so what if it wasn't a werewolf, I asked them. What if Joe didn't know what else to call it? What if it was a deformed bear? Maybe it was a prehistoric creature come back to life. Maybe it was a newly evolved animal, or something from a hidden government research lab. I don't know what it was, and really, those two kids don't know what it was either, so why not lay off of them and act like parents instead of critics? Whatever that event really was, it shook both of them up pretty badly, and they could use some support from their family while they're getting over it. Both Mom and Dad told me college was teaching me big words to use to disrespect the authority in their home. They continued to stick to their way, punishing my brother because Dogman chased him. Maybe I'll understand it if I become a parent someday, but as of right now, it seems to me that their ego and their belief system got in the way of their eyes, ears, and most importantly, their hearts. Even though a handful of years have passed since this all happened, I still think it's completely unfair that Dogman got my brother in trouble. Dogman isn't finished causing trouble, as you'll learn in this next Dogman story we've got coming up right after this.
I'd like to take a moment to say that if you have a scary story you'd like to tell us here, you can write Peter at peterbernard.com, or you can call our new Scary Stories hotline number and leave it to us in the form of a voicemail message. It's easy to remember. 804-LESCARY. That's 804-LESCARY, or 804-537-2279.
Dogman sniffed my bedroom window. Dear Scary Stories NYC, in my opinion, Dogman, whatever they eventually turn out to be, are just as interested in human culture as Bigfoot, at least according to the folklore. I've never seen a Sasquatch, but they're supposed to stare at people from behind trees and stand outside people's windows, staring in at them. I do hear some stories about Dogman doing that as well, but it's not as commonly spoken about as it is with Bigfoot. Well, my lone cryptid encounter in my life was one involving... well, let me just tell you the story. This was when I was a teenager in the mid-1970s. It would be 75 or 76, I'm guessing, because I still shared my room with my older brother when this happened. He left for college in 1977, and this happened when he was either a junior or senior in high school. The two of us, at that point, shared a bedroom in the basement of our house. We had a window between our beds that was small and up over our heads about 7 feet off the floor. Outside, that window was just a few inches off the ground. You would have to get all the way down low to look into it. So one night, we heard the weirdest sound, and we looked up to see this dog making this snuffling noise, breathing really fast, in and out, like he's trying to sniff out all the scents down in this basement. My brother and I burst out laughing because we loved dogs. We had grown up with 3 old dogs who had all died off, my mother refusing to replace any of them. So we loved dogs and missed playing with them, and this crazy, long-snouted black dog trying to stick its giant nose into our bedroom made us very happy. We wondered if he was a stray, and if our mother would let us keep him if we caught him. Then we decided to go upstairs and catch him to see what happened next. As we went out to the driveway with our one working flashlight, I shone it around on the ground, looking for the dog. I thought I had it when I saw a back leg, but moving the light around, I could only find one other dog leg. My brother grabbed the flashlight from me and moved it up. The dog was standing on its hind legs. It was one of those kinds of dogmen, and it was incredibly tall. My brother didn't even bring the flashlight all the way up. We never really finished looking at the thing. When we got up near its face, that dog made a sharp, angry movement as though the light had blinded it momentarily. Then it quickly followed its surprise with angry sounds and the baring of a scary set of teeth. This was the black dog that had been sniffing in our window, but I didn't think our mom was gonna let us keep him. I wished I could turn to liquid and just melt back through that ground level window into our bedroom, but since I couldn't, I ran after my brother to the kitchen door of our house in the back. That dog started barking at us so angrily that I remember jumping in the air each time. I prayed that our parents were still awake and that they would do something to scare this dogman off. I felt certain it was going to catch up to us, and I was squealing and crying like a little kid. When we got to the back door, my brother ran inside, and I grabbed that door. I wanted one last look at the werewolf or dogman or whatever that monster was. Even with my life on the line, I was still curious about it. I turned around, and I didn't see it. I scanned the yard from left to right and everywhere with my eyes. Then, my brother tugged me inside and locked the door. "What were you doing there?" he asked me impatiently. "Posing for pictures?" My parents were awake, but didn't seem to have been disturbed by any of this. It turned out they were watching a werewolf movie on TV. They must have thought the sound was quadraphonic. My brother and I ran from window to window, pulling back the shades, trying to figure out what direction that dogman had run off to. But we didn't see it any longer. Each time I pulled a shade back, I braced myself first that I might see a monster face right on the other side, looking right back at me. I wondered, if I saw that, would I pass out from fear right on the spot? My brother and I altered our lives after that. You live life differently once you know there's an angry giant bipedal dog that knows where you live. But it turns out, we didn't need to change a thing, because we never saw that old dogman ever again. I don't know how it knew where to find us that one night, and I don't know why it never wanted to come visit us again, but it just did, and then it just didn't. As terrifying as that thing was, I have to admit that I wish I could have gotten to see it a second or third time. When I was younger, I mean, not anymore. Now it really would make me pass out from fear at my age. But the way that event happened so naturally, so unexpectedly, we really did expect to see that creature again. Our family would take out the garbage 2 people at a time from then on. We were very careful outside after sundown, but it didn't matter because the dogman had moved on. Maybe that was the only night he was ever in our part of the world, or maybe that was the only night he was ever in our dimension or reality. All I can tell you is what I remember, and that's all I can remember about the night. Dogman sniffed in my bedroom window. We've got 2 new dogman stories for you, both submitted, albeit anonymously, by you viewers. I have no idea if they are true or creepypasta or what, but both writers claim they are for real. This first one is alleged to have taken place in a part of Oklahoma called the Panhandle. This is that small east-west strip of land north of Texas, east of New Mexico, and south of Colorado and Kansas. In fact, the story only starts on the Panhandle, then ends a bit north near a town called Liberal, Kansas. But all that gets explained in the tale, which we call the fastest dogman of all time. Dear Scary Stories NYC, do you remember a time some years back when there were a few reports of people going absolutely insane and doing horrible things to others? I'm sorry to be so vague, but I don't want to get your channel in trouble. There was a quick rush to ban bath salts as a result, but when the toxicology tests came back, it showed that none of the people who freaked out had been using bath salts, whatever it is they actually are. It was a mystery that just hung in the air until people stopped talking about it. There haven't been any more attacks like that since then that I know of, but it really was like some people had gone totally manic and full-on zombies suddenly, and for no apparent reason. Since they all met tragic ends in the events, there was no way to ask them what happened. Well, it was during that period when this story occurred, and it was most definitely on my mind, as I had been listening in the car about one of the attacks on the radio when I got a flat tire, and had to pull off the road in the dark alongside Route 54 outside of Tyrone. I felt vulnerable, I admit it, but the last thing in the world I expected to give me trouble that night was a dogman. First of all, I should explain this area. It's not your forested northeast or northwest. This is not a southern swamp or bayou area. This is not an area in which you might think to tell stories of werewolves or Bigfoot, as we don't really have all that many trees up here. I mean, you can see for miles and miles. If something is going to get you in that area, at least you got to figure you're going to see it coming. That's what made the entire experience extra weird and eerie. Not only did I see something that should be impossible, the way it happened didn't even make sense. Let me just tell the story in order, then you'll see what I'm getting at. So, I opened the trunk and got out the flat tire and jacked it up, and all that good stuff is going on. I was sweating both from being hot and being nervous. I took a couple of breaks just to survey the area. One car drove by and honked as they passed, but other than that, nothing. I hope you can get a street view photo from Route 54 to show during this part so people can see that there's just no place to hide out there. It feels like there's a lot more sky than anything else because there isn't anything to see. Now imagine that area at night when it's really dark and very quiet, and you'll start to get the picture. I couldn't wait to get the new tire on and get back on the road, yet I deliberately made sure to be careful with what I was doing and not rush the job. I had finished, and I felt like cheering when I heard a dog howl very far away. I laughed internally as though the dog were howling to celebrate my success. As I picked up my tools to put back in the trunk, I almost fell over backward in shock as that far-off dog howl was met with a much, much louder one just down the road in front of me. There was a tree or two in that direction just off the highway, but I hadn't heard anything moving there prior to the howling. Now I looked down at that tree, and standing next to it, I saw what looked like a very large dog howling. It surprised me so much that I lost my grip on my tools and they clanged to the highway loudly. Even in the dark, I could make out the dog turning to look in my direction, and when it did, I could also see golden eye shine in the darkness. The thing was looking directly at me, and then I saw it stand up, just the same as a man would. When it did that, it kind of hunched over a bit on the top, with the arms hanging in the front but to the sides, if you can try to visualize that. This was something that, in shadow, appeared to be an overly large mastiff. If you've ever seen a mastiff, they have a certain attitude and a certain way they look at you. And this creature had all of that going on. It had ears like a mastiff, a muzzle like a mastiff, a chest like an incredibly massive mastiff, and paws much larger than any canine I'd ever laid eyes on. Plus, it stood there, rocking back and forth like a kind of a prize fighter. The way it held its paws out front, but to the sides, reminded me of a boxer, except the claws it had on the ends of those hand-sized paws would not be allowed in any regulation boxing ring. I wanted to bend down and pick up my tools and put them in the trunk, but that would mean taking my eyes off this upright man-sized dog whose howling was still ringing in my ears. The big dog took a step toward me and made a sort of huffing sound that did not seem at all friendly. I immediately forgot about my tools and got into my car turning that key and gunning the engine. This was not a car that was accustomed to driving away before it had a chance to warm up, but on that night, I started driving it sooner than I ever did before or since. Now, those of you paying attention will be asking, when did he close the trunk? And the answer is, I never did. I left my tools on the road, and I left my trunk open, and so the only way I could see behind me was my side view mirror. This was not one of those new fancy magic mirror kind of cars. This was a 1982 Ford Impala with a trunk big enough to put two bodies in. My mind had already jumped to the idea of the Dogman hopping in that trunk without me even being able to see, so I was prioritizing getting up to the speed limit as quickly as I could get that old car to go. I needn't have worried, though, as the Dogman, it turned out, had higher goals than merely stowing away in my trunk and getting a ride. Nope. This guy had already decided he didn't like me, and that he had something personal against me. This Dogman didn't care about my car. He only cared about sending a message to me. I looked out that side window, wondering how far behind me the Dogman was, and it was one of those things may appear closer in real life kinds of mirror moments, as somehow that Dogman was already running alongside the rear of my car, and he looked as though he might be about to pass me on my left. I gunned the engine and we started to pull away from the creature, but then it dropped to all fours and ran like some kind of a big wolf. The thing I noticed at that moment is that the eye shine was not eye shine. It didn't only happen when the creature was in the dark, although it was more noticeable then. The creature's eyes seemed to be actually lit from within, if that makes any sense at all. And it was this golden-colored hue. It was hard not to stare at, and I had to force myself to keep my eyes on the road. I was praying for traffic in the other direction, preferably a cop, but it was just the quietest night of all time. The creature threw itself at my car several times, as though it wanted to force me off the road. I couldn't believe how absurd this had gotten. A living creature trying to force a car off the highway? I glanced into my side view mirror again, though, and the utter contempt I saw in those animal eyes sent an icy chill straight through me, along with a jolt of adrenaline. I swerved the car left, then right, then left again, trying to return the favor to the huge dog thing. By that point, we were driving past private homes. We were getting closer to town. I saw the lights of Liberal, Kansas in the distance, and the dog must have too, because he just ran off to the left. I tried to see where he was going, but he was soon blocked by houses and buildings. I want to say that the thing was unnaturally fast. Imagine being able to go 50 miles per hour, but not just on a highway. Imagine being able to run through the streets of a town and through people's backyards at 50 miles an hour. That's what I saw this thing doing until I couldn't see it anymore. Granted, my old Heap was not able to go much faster than 55 or 60, and that's what made this a real race. But what kind of animal is it that can keep up with even a 30-year-old car? It's just not possible. And so that's why I call my story the fastest Dogman of all time. Dogman sent my grandpa to an old age home. Dear Scary Stories NYC, this is a story about Dogman, and this is a story about my grandpa. It's also a story about how Dogman is not only a dangerous entity or creature, but it can also be bad for your mental health if you are exposed to one. especially if you're a personality type like my grandpa. Grandpa likes to watch TV. He only watches one channel, though, and he watches it all the time. He thinks that channel tells the truth, and all other channels lie. This particular channel has a real problem with one particular politician, so my grandfather absolutely loathes that politician. He blames everything on that guy. The first time he ever told me about seeing Dogman on his property, the story was already intertwined with all this mythology he had inserted about how the government, and this one specific politician especially, was behind him having Dogman haunting his property. It was hard to figure out if anything was actually happening, or if Grandpa was just losing it mentally. I kept suggesting that he turn off the TV for a while, but he was a real addict, and he couldn't even go an hour without a fix. I figured out that I was going to have to arrange to stay with Grandpa for a week or two. First of all, I could see how well he seemed mentally, and second of all, I could see if there really was any large animal, or person pretending to be a large animal, haunting his land. I mostly work off my computer, so it was easier for me to do it than anyone else in the family. We had all become increasingly concerned about what might be the right thing to do for him moving forward. So I found it was easy for me to get my work done at Grandpa's since he stayed in his room watching TV almost all the time. My first day, I mostly observed him. I figured I would try to interact with him a bit more each day, at different times of the day, in between my work. That first night, though, things got interesting. Fast. It was 3:08 a.m. according to my alarm clock when I woke up to the sound of my grandfather shouting. He was saying something that sounded threatening, and it took me a few minutes to really wake up enough to understand what was happening. I discovered him by the window in the bathroom, waving his fist and telling someone to go away. I looked out the window, and to my extreme shock, I saw what you would have to call a dog-headed man, and it was standing right in the middle of Grandpa's yard. It was maybe a 100-foot yard ending in trees, and this 6 or 7 foot tall hairy man with a wolf-like head was standing about 50 feet away. It was the singularly most incredible thing I had ever seen. I absolutely can't begin to explain the utter surprise of the moment for me. It was like drinking 10 cups of coffee in a second, and it's a moment that I can never forget. When that thing saw me at the window, it did something I hadn't expected. It ran toward us. I backed away to the wall, making pathetic Jerry Lewis sounds like I was the comedy relief in this story. I guess I was. Grandpa kept shouting about how the dog man worked for the government, and that thing kept trotting closer. Grandpa said it wanted to get a better look at me, and he dragged me up to the window. He told the dog man that I was going to help Grandpa get rid of that hairy and ugly old thing. He told the beast that now he had a witness, and with a witness, nobody could call him crazy anymore. Now something could be done. He was making logical sense. The only problem was, I didn't want to play that role. I had come there to help Grandpa, not to become a public dogman believer. I work with some very straight-laced people who would not look kindly on me talking about dogman in public too much. They could easily hire other people to do the gigs they hire me for, and so I will only talk about dogman off the record, even for the sake of my grandpa. As my grandfather held me up by the window and wouldn't let me leave, I actually caught a whiff of that thing. Talk about wet dog smell. This was that times 100. That smell cued me in that this was not a man in a costume. This was some kind of actual being. I don't know what I witnessed, but that was its actual physical form. Or one of them if it was a werewolf, I guess. When it got closer, I have to say, I don't think it resembled anything else on Earth. It didn't really exactly look like a dog's head when I saw it up close. And it didn't exactly look like a man's body either. It didn't exactly look mammalian. And it didn't exactly look marsupial. The way it blinked its eyes was abnormal or unnatural. Even the way it moved its jaw was strangely odd and disorienting. But it was definitely physically there. It made sounds, and it smelled bad, and it blocked out whatever it was standing in front of. It was a dogman, and it was right there. I managed to talk my grandfather into letting me leave the bathroom, and I'm sorry to say I went back to my bedroom and I just cried. Part of me told me I had to get my grandfather out of the bathroom before he got hurt by the monster, but another part of me said Grandpa was as out of control as the dogman, and I wasn't going to be able to control either one of them. It was too great a shock to my system having to take this all in, and I have to admit that I fell apart, and I just cried myself to sleep that night like a little baby. I told my tearful story to other members of the family, and they started wondering if the entire family was insane genetically somehow. It was sort of generally decided to find a home for Grandpa just to get him out of harm's way. 2 of the family claimed they believed me about the dogman, but 3 other people I won't mention told me I was crazy. They did, though, believe that something was happening that sounded dangerous, and they wanted to remove Grandpa from the danger. Eventually, he agreed to go to this home that's more like an apartment complex than an old school kind of old age home. It's actually pretty nice. I wish I could live there sometimes. And the best part of all about Grandpa's new apartment? It's on the 5th floor, and there are no dogmen in sight as far as the eye can see. And that's because Dogman sent my grandpa to an old age home. Dim your lights and get set for 2 more Dogman stories. We have a story of a young man and a librarian trapped in a rural library by a dogman that won't let them leave. But that's later on. First, we're going to share this story sent in by one of our viewers, which they claim really happened. Obviously, since the story is anonymous, we have no way of checking into these assertions. Maybe it's real, maybe it isn't. But it seems to me that it's pretty scary. Depending on where you live and when you grew up, you either are or are not familiar with the term creature features. It was either the name of a local horror movie show in your hometown, or it wasn't. For decades, there have been a bunch of different TV shows in different places with different hosts showing different movies at different times on different channels, all called creature features. But this is a story about an East Coast version of creature features, one with a host that passed on almost 20 years ago already. And this story is called The Creature Features Dogman. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I want to tell you a story about the time I saw Dogman outside my family's home up in New Rochelle back in the 1970s. And the sighting happened while I was watching a werewolf movie on the local New York Creature Features program that was on back then. First of all, let me start from the beginning and make sure you understand what I'm talking about. If you've ever seen or heard of Svengoolie, then you know what a horror host is. If you haven't heard of him, then maybe you've heard of Elvira, or Zachary, or Vampira. New York, when I was a kid, had a show on Channel 5 called Creature Features, and it had a horror host, sort of. Basically. Actually, it was just the announcer they had working at the station at the time, a guy named Lou Steele. You could find videos of him on YouTube saying, "It's 10 p.m. Do you know where your children are?" and other announcements like that. If you lived in New York, New Jersey, or Connecticut back then, you knew and recognized his voice because you heard it all hours of the day and night. But on either Friday or Saturday nights, I can't honestly remember which, he played The Creep, and he hosted a weekly horror movie on Creature Features. The Creep didn't do as much as most horror hosts in history. In fact, he just showed a tight close-up of his face while he wore Elvis shades. That was it. And I remember the video being overexposed, so it was hard to make out much of anything. Even the opening graphics were indecipherable. What was that supposed to be? Something about all the strangeness of it felt alarming to me as a kid. Something about low-budget affairs are frightening in a way that more polished efforts can never be. The music itself would automatically make me scared, like Pavlov's TV viewer. I knew it was from some scary old movie, but I was never able to place which one. These days, of course, I can look it up in a second, and it turns out to be the theme from It Came from Outer Space. It was just a minute of the theme before the movie started, yet somehow it would excite me to the very core of my being. Now, I would have permission for the next 90 minutes to 2 hours to see the scariest things in the world, and to be so scared I could hardly breathe. Yet, I could do it from the safety of my own bedroom, with my parents upstairs to protect me if the Frankenstein monster came staggering down our block and wanted to get in at me. Most weeks, that's how I would keep myself from getting too scared. I would reason that if the monster in the movie were going to want to get at me, they'd have to get into the first floor of our house first, get past my parents, and then come downstairs. There was no direct exit to the outside from our basement where my room was, so most monsters didn't upset me too much. I figured I would hear them trying to get past my father upstairs long before they would come down to get me. The only monster that truly, deeply upset me in those old movies was the Blob. That monster could probably slime its way under our doors and through our windows, and I'd be a dead duck. This was all fun to think about until the night a real, actual monster put a stop to the fun. I would watch the Creature Features show standing up between my bed and the television set. I always started off in bed with the covers pulled up to my chin. But I loved monster and science fiction movies so much, the show would hit a commercial, and I would realize I had gotten out of bed and crept up close to the television set. In my defense, TV back then was not like TV now. The picture would get fuzzier or clearer based on helicopters flying overhead or taxicabs driving by outside. And there was no rewind button either. It was a grainy, wobbly, little square image wiggling vaguely in front of you with some tinny, scratchy, poorly mixed mono sound coming out of a small, antique speaker. That was television back then, and we adored it. To a level that you no longer can when it's in HD and you can pause it. Now television is our slave and obeys our whim. Back then, television was the lord and master, and if the reception started going out, you walked to different parts of the room, sometimes holding the antenna out in weird positions, demonstrating your honest devotion to the TV gods so that they might grant you an image clear enough to comprehend. It was a different time. There was one feature of this Creature Features that was different from other shows I would watch, either back then or since then. You could send in a postcard to the show through snail mail with your name and phone number on it. Then they might call you on the phone, and you'd be on the show with them, or your voice would be. The thing is, you'd have to know the secret special code message, or you wouldn't win anything. I think the big prize was $500, but I don't remember anyone ever winning that. You see, all through the movie, at random moments, a word would appear on screen during a scene. I would write the word down. Later in the movie, another word would appear. Soon enough, you'd have the entire secret message from the creep. Then, if he called your phone and you knew the message, you might get to have your voice on live TV, and you might win a lot of money. I had never had $500 in my entire life. I couldn't imagine what I'd do with it, past buying a 10-speed bicycle. Something about the idea that the creep himself was actually awake somewhere in the city, watching this show along with me, ready to call someone, maybe me, live on the air. The show was taking place privately in the safe space of my bedroom, yet it was also taking place everywhere in New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut, all at the same time. Something about that added a different kind of excitement and a different kind of nervousness to the show for me. Each week, I would tell myself that I would send in that postcard and take that chance on being called. Each week, I would chicken out, though, and tell myself that this would be another week of practice. Then next week I'd send in the postcard. After all, I was extremely nervous about the idea of talking on the phone to someone as famous as the creep. Would I be able to do it? Or would I become nervous, with my voice cracking and my words stuttering? In short, every single thing about this show terrified and fascinated me. Now, we had no bathroom downstairs in our house. My bedroom was down there and my mother's washroom, and oddly there was a shower there but no toilet. So I would go just before Creature Feature started each weekend upstairs before I went down to watch the show. If I had to go again during the movie, that would mean waiting till a commercial, then running upstairs in the dark past all the places in the house that a monster would hide if a monster were going to hide somewhere. It was terrifying because they might reach out and grab you, and you would never know they were even there until it was too late. And on the way to and from the bathroom, you would have to pass the big hall of windows. Just a long hallway with paintings on the left and windows on the right, looking out onto the trees outside at night. I would prevent my eyes from looking out most nights. I was certain I would see a monster out there, probably the one in that night's movie, and I just didn't want to know. On the way back, now the paintings would be on my right, and those windows, they would be on my left. That night, I tried not to look at them, but something moved, and I saw it was something as large as my father, so I screamed. Then, I realized it was in fact my father. He too had gotten up to use the restroom, but I got there first, so he was waiting patiently for me to finish. He shushed me and called me over, pointing out something he seemed amazed at. I was so scared I couldn't move at first, but he grabbed me by the shoulder and tugged, so I went where he indicated and looked where he pointed. It was there, among the trees toward the back of the yard, and it was squatting down, and holding something that was colored more lightly than it was. It was staring off at something we couldn't see beneath us somewhere. It looked like a man in a costume, I'll admit. But it was an elaborate costume if it was one. I'll try to describe it. The fur was longish and reddish, and it reminded me of Dr. Zaius from the 1970s Planet of the Apes movies. It didn't have an ape mask on. The face mask was breathtakingly well crafted and resembled a big old wolf or dog head. The mask, if it was a mask, was far more realistic than anything I'd seen in a Hollywood movie at that time. It was so dark I couldn't be sure, but it seemed to move around as though it were a real head, not a mask. The outfit had to have been form-fitting because even with all the fur on top, I could make out that it had a broad and muscular chest. Something about the long, tall ears seemed real too, but I can't put my finger on how or why from my childhood memories. They didn't just stick up like Batman ears, they moved freely, like the way a cat or dog's ears move. And they were on top of the head, not on the side the way our ears are. We didn't have a word for dogman back then, so to me this thing was a werewolf. A werewolf not wearing clothes, but still a werewolf. I had nothing else to compare it to. The scariest thing about all this wasn't anything about that monster out of the window, though. The scariest thing to me was that when I looked back at my father, he seemed really frightened. That gave me a sense of hopelessness. I knew I was no match for a werewolf, but if my dad was that scared as well, then my mother and I were in bad shape. I started to cry, and my father told me angrily to stop, which made me cry more, which got him angrier and frustrated. Taking me completely by surprise, he slammed the window in front of us up and open and leaned his head out. Then he shouted out at that werewolf man to get off his property. My father sounded like an angry, growling dog himself on that night, and the dogman actually stood up in reaction on its hind legs and looked toward the two of us as though he hadn't realized there were a house there before. As he stood, you could see how absurdly tall he was, and I gasped. My father reached back and held my shoulder, never taking his eyes off the werewolf. I got the hint and held still, keeping quiet. A tense moment passed that felt like it was an hour long, but was probably 10 seconds. My father stared at the werewolf, and that thing stared right back at him. And then it just turned and walked off, and the mood lightened considerably. Dad woke Mom up, and we all watched the rest of that week's Creature Features together. I never did send in a postcard to the show, but I'll never forget the Creature Features. Dogman. Don't go away, we've got another all-new scary Dogman story. Dogman trapped us in the library. Dear Scary Stories NYC. This is a story that happened in the 1980s when I was something like 12 or 13. I remember it took place around Valentine's Day when it was cold, on a Friday the 13th that was also a full moon. I was very superstitious back then, and I had been anticipating this day coming since late the year before when I spotted it on the upcoming calendar. Yep, I was a weird kid. I would stop in stores to look at calendars of the following year to see what day my birthday was falling on, and other holidays too. I would also look for Friday the 13th, and was struck that whatever year that was, we were going to have a Friday the 13th that was also a full moon night. For me, this was a big deal, but no matter how much I talked about it, all I ever did was annoy the others around me, none of whom found any of this interesting in the slightest. I kept telling people it was the one night all year when they were most likely to see a werewolf, and they kept giving me a charity laugh, then walking away. It turned out to be the one and only time, though, that I ever made a psychic prediction in my entire life. Or at least the only time I made one that turned out to be exactly 100% true. It was mid-February and I was doing my homework in our local library. The building it's in is the last one to close in that neighborhood on Fridays, and since it's just across the forest, near the edge of town, it can be a bit creepy walking home from there with the sun going down. Nevertheless, after I finished my homework, I noticed I was the last member of the public in there, and so I helped the librarian put books back. This way she wouldn't have to stay late. She was a nice and patient lady, probably in her 30s back then. Let's call her Mrs. Brady, because she reminded me of that lady from the Brady Bunch TV show. Not the mom, I mean the maid in the blue dress. She was a bit goofy, but she always knew how to find a book or magazine that would help you with your schoolwork or projects. I found her a relief to be around, because she was the only adult who didn't act superior to me and talk down to me. Even when she taught me lessons, it was more in the way a friend would than a teacher or a parent. I didn't feel I had anything to prove to her, and so she was the first adult I could be honest around. I finished picking up the books she asked me to put away, and I stood leaning on one of the windows of the building, looking out at the woods across the street. I was in no rush to get started home. I felt free at the library and less so at home. And then, in 1 second, I saw something out of that window that took all of my feelings of freedom away. I saw, standing behind some of the trees, a large, man-sized thing. It was not a man, though, as I could clearly see it was covered not in clothing, but in fur. It had a dog-shaped head, so it was not a Bigfoot. I had no name at the time for what I was witnessing, and my first impression was that it must be a mutated or diseased Bigfoot or great ape of some kind. I rushed to get Mrs. Brady, and I brought her back to the window. At first she didn't see it, but when I heard her gasp, I knew she finally had. "It's a costume," she said, but she didn't sound like she believed herself. "A costume of what?" I asked. "It looks like Chewbacca with a wolf head." It's a werewolf costume," Mrs. Brady suggested, unconvincingly. Then, that creature or man or Chewbacca with a dog head turned suddenly and looked directly at us. We took a step or two back, and I saw Mrs. Brady cross herself, so I did too. I didn't really know what it meant, but I had seen it in movies. I think they were vampire movies, though, not Bigfoot with wolf head movies. Although I distinctly remember that thing's eyes lit up when it looked at us, so maybe it was a vampire. I mean, the eyes lit up brightly, and it was like painful light being shot into your eyes. I hadn't noticed it until it looked directly at us, though. So, the thing just sort of stayed there, across the street from the entrance to the library. It was half in and half out of the woods. I'd been planning on walking home, and Mrs. Brady was going to wait for the bus which stopped directly outside. Both our plans were kind of put on hold now, since neither of us had the nerve to go out there with that thing standing right there across the street, looking at us. Mrs. Brady let me call my mom with the library phone, and I told her there were tough kids across the street that wouldn't let us leave. I didn't tell her anything about a dog-headed Bigfoot. Mom sounded alarmed and said she'd be right over. I went back out to the front window and asked Mrs. Brady if the thing was still there. She didn't answer, though, because she didn't have to. Before I could finish my words, that thing outside howled. It was one of those howls that sounds so pained and so painful that it makes you want to cry. At one point, the creature achieved a tone that caused the window in front of us to vibrate so hard that both of us instinctively took a few steps back, fearing that it might be about to shatter. Whatever that animal or man thing was out there, it was something that you aren't gonna ever encounter the likes of ever again. My mother showed up in her Pinto with her brother carrying a Louisville Slugger. While I watched them pull up, the Dogman must have made its exit. I never actually saw it leave or where it went to, but I didn't care. Mrs. Brady locked up as I ran to the car. Mom's brother seemed disappointed that there was nobody there for him to tangle with. Mom and my uncle drove Mrs. Brady home. Then we went home ourselves. I never did tell them about the creature that we had seen that day, and I never heard another story about it appearing in our area ever again. It wasn't like I was afraid to go to the library after that, and the same goes for Mrs. Brady. To us, that Dogman sighting was just sort of one of the kinds of things you'd expect to happen when the full moon falls on Friday the 13th, because that was the day Dogman trapped us in the library. Here's a story that might sound cute, but don't let that cause you to let your guard down. This is a scary little story based on an email we received recently called "My Cat Scared Dogman Away." Dear Scary Stories NYC, I live in a town in New Jersey that I don't want to name. We are far closer to Philadelphia than to New York City, and it's been a great place to live for my entire life. Now, my wife and I are raising our own family here. One of the things that has changed during my lifetime is that bears, which never used to come near, now brazenly walk right into people's backyards. And, apparently, judging by what happened to my family, bears are not the only large predators walking through town. And I found this out because my cat scared Dogman away. We, as I mentioned earlier, have two very young children, a boy and a girl. We also have a female cat who was living with us before we had any kids. She's large and in charge, so for this story, let's call her Marge. Now, Marge once scared a dog off our property that was twice her size. It was some sort of beagle-looking mixed breed, and it thought it could mess with her, but she went into hissing mode and showed him her teeth. He wasn't a smart puppy, so he didn't take her message to heart. He made one more move in her direction, and she turned into some kind of feline three-dimensional lawnmower, with her super sharp cat claws flying in every direction unpredictably, her teeth snapping out in between, and she rose up on her hind legs during this to increase her size. That dog never took such a licking, and he ran off making sounds like a broken water pipe. Meanwhile, Marge was just sitting there, grooming herself like nothing had ever happened. She's not one to be messed with. So, the time she messed with Dogman went like this. It was nighttime, and Marge wanted to go out. I know I just told you we had bears, and I know we shouldn't have been letting her out, but at that point we still were. Now she's got a fenced-in porch she can sit outside in, but other than that, she's an indoor cat. However, back then we still tossed her outside to do her business, and this, in fact, is the story of why we stopped doing that. Marge was scratching to go out the back door, and my wife was talking on her phone. She let the cat out, then went and stood outside in the dark just to get a breath of fresh air while chatting with her sister or whoever it was at the time. Marge usually trotted down the stairs, went only a little way into the yard, did her business, then scratched dirt on top of it to hide it. Not that time. That time, she tore off down the stairs and across the back of the yard into the darkness where my wife couldn't see her. She said Marge was making an angry yowling sound she had never even heard before. So, my wife ran back in the house and turned on the overhead lights we have to light up the backyard if we're having a party or whatever. She screamed for me at this point. I couldn't understand what she was saying, but it sure sounded urgent, so I ran to the backyard. Both of us saw our cat screeching and arching its back, hissing at this dark silhouette standing just beyond our back fence. And here's the thing about the figure out there. It was not a bear. It was a kind of bipedal dog. It was like a prehistoric man all covered in fur, and its back legs were bent and animal-like, not ape or human-shaped, and its head was like a dog. Maybe it even was just an incredibly large dog that was leaning against our chain-link back fence. I don't know, because I only saw it standing there. My wife told me it was too wide at the waist to be a dog. It seemed to be a cross between a human or primate with a dog. We have both seen bears with mange, and this was not that. We both are aware that those can seem very much like Dogman, but this was a dog-headed creature. It had dog ears on top, not bear ears, and we both can tell the difference at a glance. My wife told me it was my job to rescue Marge from that thing, so I ran inside to find something I could use to defend myself against it. I found nothing, and then I ran back outside in time for my wife to say that it had walked away. I couldn't see the Dogman anywhere, but I saw large Marge once again sitting there grooming as though nothing had happened. According to my wife, the large creature walked away like a man. It didn't drop to all fours before retreating. It simply realized it had met its match in Marge, then turned around and walked away on its hind legs as though that were normal. My wife was flabbergasted, and she just kept repeating this information to me over and over again, as though I didn't understand what she said to me the first time. So, like I said, that is why we screened in our back porch, and that is why we don't let Marge out any longer. Because of the night that my cat scared Dogman away. Well, that's it. Those are all the Dogman stories I have for today. Time for your grand finale that you promised all of us. Oh, I think you'll like this one. It's from a viewer who claims that not only is he allegedly afflicted with the supposed cause of werewolfism, known as lycanthropy, but he represents the 6th generation of his family to be suffering from this curse. And that's why this story is called 6 Generations of Werewolves. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I am the 6th son of the 6th generation of a family cursed with lycanthropy. I am the last to suffer this disease, and if I have children, they will be 7th generation and therefore free from this affliction. My great-great-great-grandfather Silas got himself stupidly involved in conflict over reports of werewolf sightings. This was in some town in Arizona, supposedly. Some small town that probably hasn't existed in 70 years, as far as I know. People were claiming to see werewolves back then, and so this old woman living on the edge of town was blamed for it, just like an old-fashioned witch hunt. The legend is that her dying wish was to put a curse on my family, turning the sixth son of each generation into werewolves ourselves for 6 generations. I have no idea how much of that origin story is true, but I know the lycanthropy part is real, as its mastery over my life and the decisions I am able to make is unshakable. Now, I inherited nothing from my father except his lycanthropy, but my great-grandfather has left us a house built specially for our family problem. Great-grandpa Clem was the first truly successful person in our family line, and it was his intention to make certain that his descendants would have an easier go of it for the last 2 generations of the curse. He built us a large house with a basement and a sub-basement. In that sub-basement is what we call the werewolf cells, because that's exactly what they are. These are cells built out of 12-foot thick concrete walls, with one steel-reinforced security door for each, and chains that haven't been broken once in these 3 generations. There is a shelf built into the wall in each to place food on, and metal drains located where the floor subtly slants downward. There are ventilation shafts hidden in the ceiling. It's easy to hose it down in the morning after to keep it clean. Really, I have to hand it to Great-Grandpa Clem. It's very simply, yet very intelligently designed. For 3 nights every month, during the full moon, I bring some raw meat and a big bowl of water down to the cell, and I lock myself in. Then, I chain myself up and try to fall asleep before the change happens. I find transforming to be extremely uncomfortable and unsettling, although I wouldn't exactly call it painful. I have been able to sleep through it, but it doesn't always work. A big part of the transformation for me personally is the complete loss of consciousness on my part. I have no memories about what it's like to be the lycanthrope, but I can see the evidence of the change after I wake up. I think that's why I'm sometimes able to sleep through it. I'm sure whoever I am becoming has some sort of consciousness at that point, while I myself am either dreaming or else entirely unconscious. These are guesses on my part, as I really have no perceptions or memories from being in that other state. There are 2 other cells besides mine. The sub-basement is large enough to accommodate 3 generations of werewolves at once. Now, before my great-great-grandfather Clem hit it rich in the early 1930s, when everybody else was going poor, the first 2 generations of werewolves in my family had a rough going of it. Silas and then his son Samuel spent the late 1800s through the early 1900s moving around from town to town and state to state, trying to escape their reputation as a werewolf clan. But even when they managed to fit in, things would start to go wrong when the full moon came around. They tried tying the afflicted ones down, but they could break free of any bond. Anytime things started to look up for the family, one of the werewolves would break free during the full moon and go on a rampage. While in the werewolf or lycanthropic state, the victim loses all sense of morality or social conditioning. He or she can sometimes just do whatever it wants, no matter how foul or unforgivable the deed might be. Then, they follow their homing instinct back to the place they live in while in their human form, leaving all sorts of evidence along the way home of their guilt. The fact that my family was able to survive that dark period is almost a miracle in itself, After my great-grandfather Clem was told as a child that he would become a werewolf upon reaching manhood, he went out and found himself employment. He worked factory jobs it would no longer be legal for a kid to work, and he saved up enough to buy himself chains strong enough to hold a bull elephant, and enough concrete to cement one end of each of those chains into a 3-foot thick floor in their basement. After that, he was able to lock his father in before the transformations each month, and once it came time for him to change as well, he could join his father in that basement. I guess surviving years in that manner gave Clem the ideas he needed to put in the more deluxe cells we use now. I say deluxe, but it's really just a whole lot of concrete and steel. We've left the ventilation system as it was in the early 20th century. These were built to last, at least to last through the end of my life. Lycanthropy, like some other afflictions, can have its effects largely mitigated if you possess the wealth to do so. I call our sub-basement the Bat Cave, only instead of helping me to be a hero, this Bat Cave prevents me from being a villain. I dated a young woman a few years back when I was 20. She and I started getting serious and she wanted to get closer. I told her about the werewolf thing, expecting it to be the end of all of it. I thought she would be turned off by the idea, either because she believed me and was terrified, or because she didn't believe me and thought I had bats in my belfry. Instead, something kind of the opposite happened. She liked me more after seeing the basement cells and figuring out that I was not joking or exaggerating in any way about any part of this. She wanted to see me transform. She wanted me to go public about the whole thing. She wanted me to transform in public. She had this weird notion that I was the last of my kind, and I owed it to society and medical science to educate the public about lycanthropy. My attitude was more like I was the last in my line who would need to bear the shame of this curse. Better to keep it a secret so that if I have children, none of them will have the specter of the curse hanging over them. None of them would ever even have to think about any of this. If I do have kids, maybe I'll even keep it a secret from them. Why would they even need to know, really? But this girl, she was all about werewolf rights and how I should reclaim my destiny and all this stuff. She'd give me these inspiring speeches about how I should run with the wolves, because that's what I was, and that she wanted to run along with me. Of course, if we did that, she would have lasted about 30 seconds before ending up as Dogman doggy food, but she didn't seem to grasp that part of it at all. To her, this was a very romantic thing. For a while, I thought about figuring out a way to let her watch the transformation. If she saw the difference between her fantasy version of it and the ugly reality of it, that she would understand. But there was no way to let her see without placing her in harm's way. I tried taping a small camera to the wall and leaving it on record, but by the next morning, it had been smashed to bits. The Dogman is shy and doesn't like to be photographed, I suppose. And so that's my story. At least so far. I'm sorry if it wasn't as exciting as some werewolf stories, but I'm not really sorry. I hope to keep it as boring as I can, to be completely honest. I think you would too, if you were in my situation. I wonder, if I live another 100 years, will this house remain strong enough to hold me inside it? If not, I better become wealthy enough to restore it in time, because I am the final member of 6 generations of werewolves. We hope you enjoyed our special hour-long Dogman show today, and we'd be honored if you'd please leave a comment saying whether you thought my stories were scarier or Henry's. That's right. So, who was scarier this time? We'd love for you to tell us. Keep it scary. Ciao for now, yo. Hey, it's me, Henrey Lee Dogman, here to thank those of you who support all of us here at Scary Stories NYC. It really helps us if you click like, and if you forward our videos or leave cool comments. If you can, it helps us even more when you let us share our 25 episode and growing collection of uncensored, scary Dogman stories with you by becoming a paid subscriber at peterbernard.com. That's right. Join our monthly club and get 25 stories right off the bat, each of them wilder than what we're allowed to tell you on this channel. Then, each Sunday, get another new scary story, usually a Dogman story, but always uncensored and secret, available nowhere else on the planet. Please consider joining us today at peterbernard.com and keep the scary stories coming. Thanks, everyone.
Come back for more scary stories.